refuge in generating bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, Dhamma, Dream Assembly. By the merits I create Dhamma, may I become a Buddha. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha. By the merits I create to listen to Dhamma, Buddha, out of the best beings. Refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, to Dhamma, and Supreme Assembly. I create to listening to the Dhamma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Abandon evil doing, practice virtue well, subdue your mind. This is the Buddha's teachings. Are not an illusion or a flame, a magical illusion, a dewdrop or a bubble, like a dream, a flash of lightning or a cloud. One consider all compounded. By this merit may we attain omniscience. I'm our enemy. Beings buffeted birth, age, sickness, and death. Existence, not a perfection of wisdom. I prostrate to the Arya triple gem. Thus did I hear at one time the Bhagavan's dwelling on massive vultures mountain. Rajagriha together with a great community of monks. At that time, the Bhagavan was exposed, a concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattvacharyavatara looked upon the very practice, profound perfection of wisdom, beheld those five acts as empty of inherent nature. Then to the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra, the distant Bodhisattva, Bodhisattvacharyavatara, how should any son of the lineage train practice the activity, found perfection of wisdom? Bodhisattvacharyavatara, the Venerable Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage wish to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look like this. And repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also is empty. Form is empty. Form. Empty is not other than form. Form is also not other. In the same way, feeling, compositional factors in empty. Shariputra likewise, all phenomena, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, empty. No feeling, no eye, no ear, no nose, no body, no mind. No visual form, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. No elements and so on, including no mind element and no mental consciousness. Ignorance, no extinction of on up to and including no aging and death, no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there's no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There's no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also Shariputra, therefore, because there's no attainment, Bodhisattvas rely on the perfected wisdom, mind without us and without, having completely passed beyond error, all three times also manifestly awakened to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment, and some perfection. The mantra of the perfect knowledge, equal to suffering, should be known as truth since it's not false. Wisdom is gate, paragate, parasamgate, bodhisoha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, found perfection of wisdom like Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, saying, said, well said, son of the lineage, it is like that, it is like it's the profound perfection of wisdom. You have indicated, let's rejoice. The Bhagavan spoken to put of existence, both surrounding their entirety, the gods, humans, Gandharvas, praise that spoken. promise my guru and protector Manjushri, who holds to his heart a scriptural text, overseeing all things as they shines forth as by delusion, ignorance, who ways with the loving, but Father for his only Son, all creatures sorrow, confused in the darkness of their ignorance. You whose dragon thunder-like proclamation of Dharma are out of our delusion, iron chains of Dharma, reveals the sword of wisdom hewing down suffering wherever its sprouts appear, clearing away the darkness of all ignorance. The body is adorned, marks of a Buddha, this completed the 10 stages effect of a Bodhisattva. The beginning. I bow down to you, Manjushri. Om Rapatsanandi. Wisdom of illuminate the darkness and close my mind, like my intelligent wisdom and insight. So the texts that explain them. By the virtue of offering to you, assembly of Buddhas, visualized before me, built on a base, water and incense. The moon. May all sentient beings share in its good effects. Please enjoy and bless me and all sentient beings. Release this mind. I am offering to my body, friends and strangers, the objects, greed, hatred. The Venerable Lama, in the skies of your Dhamma calm wisdom, this vast and profound Dhamma could need of trained. Idam Guru Ratnam Natlakam Tayami. I send forth this jeweled mandala to you, Gurus.
Thank you very much. So we'll just spend a few moments composing our minds and principally withdrawing from the hustle bustle of our day's affairs. Becoming aware of our breath coming and going for a cycle of 21. And now, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama recommends, we simply observe our mind, not thinking or recollecting past events, nor projecting, running after anticipated or future events, but rather simply settle in the present moment, the moment of bare awareness of the unfolding of our own mind, which is in the nature of luminous knowing. Just rest there. And now we generate a powerful bodhicitta aspiration to become fully enlightened for the benefit of all our suffering mothers, feeling it is for this purpose that we're going to share the precious teachings of Shantideva's Guide to a Bodhisattva's Way of Life together. And with that, we can begin the commentary. It's really quite remarkable to have the stability from week to week to be able to have access to these precious teachings. And I'm about to turn 70. I can't believe it. I should believe it because I'm meant to be meditating on death and impermanence continuously and have realizations left, right, and center. But nonetheless, I'm going to be 70. And only a few minutes before, I was in my 40s. And seconds before that, I was a young person running around crazily. So how does this happen? Every single minute counts. So let's savor the preciousness of our time. So to briefly touch upon last week, we concluded with a line in verse 89, which read, not giving teachings, talking about the vessels of receiving teachings, not giving teachings to a woman unaccompanied by a man. Together, we navigated several possible pathways for interpreting this verse, particularly when we consider it in terms of our contemporary secular setting. However, we also acknowledged that sensitive issues regarding formal restraints involving the nature of ordination vows and related samaya were also involved, and that when viewed from the perspective of a monk or a nun giving teachings, there are indeed reasons to adopt appropriate protocol out of respect for all parties, both for the vessel receiving the teachings and for the giver of the teachings themselves. Pema Chodron, herself ordained, as we know, in her account of this line, goes as far as to propose, and I quote, "These days, a monk probably wouldn't have a problem teaching to women unescorted." And she adds, "But in Shantideva's time in India, it was considered shocking. So when in India, do as the Indians do. This is another Bodhisattva guideline." End of quote. So I'm reminded here, I'm just going to sort of segue slightly, of problems in Bali, which is sort of north of Australia. It's one of our most popular tourist destinations, international tourist destinations. It's predominantly a classical Hindu Indonesian country where the local people are frequently upset by the manner in which tourists with no thought or respect for local customs and local sacred places pose in front of monuments, including sacred banyan trees, often naked or semi-naked, to create the most excitingly outrageous and thrilling selfie shots to share on social media. So these sacred trees are considered to be the abode of the spirits of the deceased, as well as the gods. So they're incredibly revered. So not to show respect for local and indigenous customs in this particular case is absolutely insensitive. Likewise, not climbing Uluru, the giant monolithic red rock at the centre of Australia, which is sacred to the Pitjantjatjara people. Tourists, both local and international, insist some insist on still climbing this rock, even though the locals have requested them not to do so. So these indigenous landholders of this sacred place have been looking after this site from a period of time well before that of the pyramids. Not to show respect to them as the custodians of the place is just outright arrogance. What is it about the so-called Western mentality that thinks I'm allowed to express myself no matter where I am in the world because I'm me and I'm big and I'm powerful, I'm whatever. This is an arrogance writ large. So to boil this down, to return to Shantideva more immediately, we're to consider all these social situations in terms of ethical finesse, rather than simply exert, often in very crude ways, our presumed freedom to act as we might personally wish. So to consider the remaining portion of the verse, which we didn't actually tackle last week, Shantideva writes, "The vast and profound should not be taught to lesser beings." Gyaltsabje specifies that the issue here involves an awareness of whether or not those we teach are receiving the teachings on the basis of a lesser or a greater motivation. He says, "One does not teach the profound and the vast Dharma to those who are not a vessel due to a lesser motivation." So a lesser motivation here, as a qualifier of an inappropriate vessel from this perspective, is referring to the motivation of one who is following the Hinayana vehicle. This indicates those who are training to become hearers and solitary realizers, to actually attain the fruits of those paths. As Geshe Doga says, because of their intention or motivation, they are not ready to hear the profound and extensive Dharma, so one should not teach it to them. Having said this, this isn't to say that one shouldn't teach them at all. Rather, the teaching should be adapted to suit the vehicle on which the auditors are traveling. So this is our ethical finesse again. We're modulating, tuning how we proceed on independence on the needs of the vehicle. The vast and profound in Shantideva's line is a kind of way of capturing the Mahayana vehicle itself. Kunzang Pelden spells this out more explicitly. He says, it is inappropriate to expound the profound teachings on emptiness and the vast teachings on the grounds and paths of the Mahayana to those who have the lesser attitude of the Hinayana and who aspire to the path of the Shravakas and the Pratika Buddhas. End of quote. So we must therefore be very careful in how we interpret Shantideva's intent here. In particular, we mustn't read it to somehow justify falling into a sectarian stance whereby we regard the Mahayana as superior to the Hinayana, and therefore those following the Hira and solitary realized vehicles as somehow being inferior or lesser. That is to say, and this is the crunch, as somehow lesser than those following the Bodhisattva vehicle. To think in this derogatory, even condescending way would be to reject the holy teachings of the Lord Buddha himself. He who has so carefully taught in such a way as to exactly and perfectly appeal to those of various capacities and capabilities. There is a very important reason, therefore, why His Holiness the Dalai Lama has recommended that we, in our sort of common usage, relabel the Hinayana vehicle, which is technically correct, so we're not arguing with that, as the foundational vehicle. Because all the teachings and instructions found there are indispensable building blocks upon which we build our Bodhisattva practice. This is made abundantly clear, as we know, from the structure of the Lam Rim, where the teachings on impermanence, the role of fundamental ignorance tying us to the wheel of samsara, and so forth, are prominently represented, especially in the earlier sections of the text. Bodhicitta and the profound wisdom of emptiness, which is including here the emptiness of both persons and things other than persons, can only be established on the sound and secure foundations of these earlier presentations. It makes no sense otherwise. Therefore, it would seem that the reason for not instructing those already on the foundational vehicle on how they might develop bodhicitta and the profound realization of emptiness, considered at its most subtle level here, is more to do with whether or not such a gesture is helpful and beneficial for those practitioners. Kunsang Pelden, who follows the Nema tradition, indicates that, and I quote, "One must distinguish between the teachings of ultimate meaning, the teachings of expedient meaning, and the teachings of indirect and applied meaning, and so on. One must take care to teach disciples according to their capacity." So regarding these three divisions, I'll just touch on this in passing. Longchen Yeshe Dorje, a greatly esteemed Nema Lama, explains, "The fundamental state of all phenomena, of samsara, nirvana, and the path is the naturally pure expanse of absolute reality, the luminous nature of the mind itself. The teachings of expedience, meaning refers to everything occurring at the level of relative truth. In other words, phenomena as they appear to deluded minds. Once we have understood the difference between ultimate and expedient teachings, we can go on to explore the latter, namely those the meaning of which is not explicitly stated. So for their part, the Geluk present a twofold scriptural division, that of interpretive and definitive. Definitive scripture is contrasted here with interpretive scriptures in that a definitive text is said to explicitly present the meaning of emptiness as a lack of inherent existence. But the overall gist is the same here. Because the definitive deals directly with the ultimate nature of things, whereas the second, the interpretive, provides a provisional presentation, one that must be interpreted by delving beyond the literal meaning of the words to arrive at the final meaning. So, to bring this back, pedagogically speaking, Shantideva is asking us not to give ultimate or definitive teachings to those who would be better served by giving provisional or interpretive teachings, at least for now. When it is the case that the first might confound or confuse them, the second will prove more suitable to present as they provide more easily accessible teachings, and thus ones that can be put more immediately into practice. So this is not in any way saying they're lesser, it's just that they are expedient. They can be implemented by those practitioners without any ruffles going on with their basic aim in their path, chosen path. Also, will the teaching we give be happily received when they, referring to the foundational vehicle practitioners, have already decided upon their path and are intent on pursuing the steps that they have already undertaken to pursue? In other words, will our teaching to them be respectful of their chosen ambition, their chosen pathway? The underlying question here, what right, and this is getting back to the Uluru scenario, what right do we have to seek to unsettle them from their elected vehicle? What would even be our motive in wishing to do so? If it was to involve an attempt to declare the Mahayana superior to the Hinayana, we run the risk of committing a root downfall of our Bodhisattva vows. For example, the 14th root vow, denigrating the Hinayana. This downfall occurs when with a negative mind, and especially when in the presence of a foundational practitioner, we propose, for whatever reason, that the Hinayana is inferior to the Mahayana. So it can even be implied, this sort of meaning. It is irrelevant from this denigratory perspective whether or not our opinion is utterly fabricated or is drawn from a prevailing system of textual exposition, say within a particular lineage or interpretive tradition of Buddhism, one that may, in fact, carry its own biases or prejudices. Considering this more generally, we can appreciate that if we are, in fact, being critical in a disrespectful fashion, due to somehow feeling or believing that our teachings will rescue these practitioners from a lesser fate, a lesser spiritual destiny, as it were, even while holding ourselves aloft, elevating ourselves pompously, we would actually be contravening, and this is the crunch, would be actually contravening the purpose and intent of the Buddha himself in his turning of the wheel of Dharma in a myriad of exquisitely nuanced ways. Nor would there have been any purpose in the Buddha having presented 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma. In our increasingly sectarian and fragmented world, these are certainly issues to consider seriously. Therefore, we must very carefully ascertain the meaning of the remaining lines of Shantideva's verse, which I quote, "Although I should always pay equal respect to the dharmas of the lesser and higher beings," end of quote. So Geshe Doga is very quick in his commentary of these lines to emphatically request us not to indulge in antics of one-upmanship, according to which we'll contrive to judge and arrange the Dharma of the lesser and higher beings according to unequal criteria as to their worth. He says, quote, "It is taught that if one discriminates between the superior Mahayana and the lesser vehicle on the basis of being wholesome or bad, suitable or unsuitable, becoming the method for enlightenment or not, and so forth, is abandoning the Dharma. One should therefore have equal respect for all paths and practice them all." So mention in Geshe Doga's commentary here of abandoning the Dharma possibly directly refers to another root Bodhisattva vow, this time the sixth, abandoning the Dharma. Criticizing or claiming that any part of the Hinayana, Mahayana, or Vajrayana is not part of the Buddha's teaching will incur this root downfall. This might be performed, for example, by criticizing or denigrating a teaching from the Vinaya, by criticizing a teaching found in the Sutra or the Abhidharma baskets of the Dharma, by claiming that some are not legitimate or some are corrupt or not inauthentic and so forth. Or one might claim that the Vajrayana is not genuine Dharma because it is a later creative fabrication and thus is not based on the Buddha's own teachings. So these are pertinent points. You can see, even with this brief presentation, that it's possible to break not just one, but several vows the moment we enter into the realm of prejudicial thinking, whereby we seek to arrange the Dharma in forms of petitioning, with some parts elevated and some rejected, all according to our own biased perception. Kunzang Pelden says, and when one expounds the Dharma, one should not in a partial sectarian manner be interested only in the doctrine of the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas and vice versa. For such teachings are like different kinds of food, suitable either for adults or for children. They are not to be judged in terms of good or bad. On the path of liberation, they are the same. Like the taste of molasses and salt, one cannot say that one is right and one is wrong. With this understanding, one should respectfully expound them all. In the Sarvadharma Vaidya Samgraha Sutra, the Buddha said, O Manjushri, if some people consider some of the Tathagata's teachings as good and others as bad, they have rejected the holy teachings. Geshe Jumpa Gatso is likewise at pains to express this essential point unambiguously and emphatically. So I'll quote, in general, the Mahayana is full of ideals which are so far-reaching. It is extremely vast in intention and in application. In comparison, the intentions of the other are inferior. It is quite appropriate to make this point. You'll notice that Geshe Doga also made this point. We have to be very careful here at how we interpret. But, and this is the crunch, we do not differentiate between them by saying that one is good and one is bad, one taught by the Buddha and one not, that one is good to practice and one should not be practiced. If we do, we create the very heavy karma of abandoning the Dharma. And Geshe Jumpa Gatso goes a little bit, Gatso, goes a little bit further here than the other commentators. He says, that kind of karma shoots you directly into the hell realms, like an arrow loosened from its bow, if you do not confess, that is. We must understand that all these methods were taught to attain Buddhahood, and have a sincere faith, respect, and appreciation for them all, thinking, so good for each was taught in accordance with the minds of trainees. He continues, the Buddha knows the motivations, ideas, and interests of the trainees, and therefore is able to teach them with a great variety of methods that accord with their ideas. When we teach others, we do not know their thoughts and ideas, so we can do nothing more than teach what we think we should. This is interesting, isn't it? It means we do our best based on the understanding that we do have of the situation. I presented this point somewhat elaborately due to the nature of our current cultural milieu, as I mentioned earlier, where in sectarianism and various forms of ideological triumphalism seem to be running rampant. My ideas are better than your ideas. My politics are better than your politics. My religion's better than your religion. My taste is better than your taste, etc., etc. So we have to be very, very alert to this tendency and try to quell it in its tracks. Returning to Shantideva, he is asking us very, very wisely and very carefully to determine how and what to teach Dharma-wise, not on the basis of some personal agenda, my agenda, particularly one that is emotionally and even urgently invested. I need to teach my Dharma because it's the best Dharma, because that's what I've understood to be the best. This kind of thought process is very tricky because it egotistically enshrines the Dharma. We have to somehow feed the Dharma out of this egoic bubble that we've set up. And that would damage the quality and the purity of the Dharma that we espouse or communicate. So considered in this radically open way, putting our ego aside, we can conclude that good conduct in terms of teaching others would be to teach according to the inclination of each individual, as Geshe Yeshe Topten succinctly puts it. So that's the essence of the topic. The importance of assessing the student or listener's needs and inclinations is nicely illustrated by the classic story concerning the transmission of the instructions of Tonlen, practice giving and taking. I'm going to share this story at some length. I'm going to tell a few stories today because it includes many details that will lead to our respect for the care that past masters have taken in this exact fashion. So, for some time, after Atisha and Dromtompa, the thought transformation teachings were kept secret and were only passed on to disciples who were capable and willing to put them not just into practice, but into immediate practice. The first to write them down was the Kadam Geshe Langri Tangpa, who, among the 8 close disciples of Geshe Potawa, was the only one to receive them from him. This latter Geshe was a direct disciple of Dromtompa. On this basis, Geshe Langri Tangpa had written the famous Lojong text called Thought Transformation in 8 Stanzas, which contains the verse, and I quote, "In short, I shall offer the benefit and bliss of all mothers to all mothers in this actual life and in the future continuum. And secretly, I shall take upon myself all the harms and sufferings of my mothers." And it was upon reading this verse, just quoted, that Geshe Chekawa was inspired to search for these teachings and later compose the 7-point thought transformation based on the oral instructions of Geshe Charwa, a disciple of Langri Tangpa. The account of how this transmission was extended continues. Inspired by this unusual idea that you should accept all the blame and suffering onto yourself and give away all the profit, gain and happiness to others, Geshe Chekawa travelled to Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, in search of the master who held this oral tradition and who would be able to explain it to him. Upon arriving and circumambulating the main temple, he asked people there who was the master who would teach him this text. He was told how to reach the town where the author of this text lived. But when he arrived, he found that Geshe Langri Tangpa had already passed away. He then travelled to the monastery of Geshe Charwa, a renowned teacher who was a disciple of Langri Tangpa. And this is the overlap with our immediate topic in Shantideva. When he arrived, he found Charwa giving a teaching on the path of the hearers on one of the Hinayana traditions. Confused and disappointed at the lack of any mention of bodhicitta or the awakening mind, he felt that he must search still further for a teaching on these two lines. When the discourse was over, Geshe Chekawa waited for Charwa to pass the retreat house of the monastery as he made his customary afternoon circumambulation. As was traditional practice for requesting teachings, Geshe Chekawa spread a cloth on the ground and called to Geshe Charwa as he approached with the words, "Please sit. I have some questions to you concerning the Dharma." Indignant at being stopped, Geshe Charwa replied, "I cut all doubts, leaving nothing unclear when I gave the discourse before. Where were you then, and what more do you have to ask?" Chekawa then explained to him about the lines from the book and asked whether it had any substantial reference. He explained that if it had, his only desire was to learn it. To this, Geshe Charwa replied, "Whether you like to study it or not, if you want to attain complete Buddhahood, you must understand its meaning. The scriptural authority of this verse, of these lines, is a verse from the Precious Garland by the superior Nagarjuna." After they parted, Geshe Chekawa meditated on this verse, which reads, "May I be as dear to sentient beings as their own life, and may they be very dear to me. May their negativities ripen upon me and all my virtues for them." He was then convinced that the lines from the 8 verses of thought transformation had a sound basis. He returned to see Charwa and asked him if he could spend more time in the study of its meaning with him, to which Charwa replied, and again, this is where we have an overlap with our immediate topic. Then Geshe Chekawa asked why Charwa had not spoken about the awakening mind when he had given the discourse. In a mood of despair, he replied that it was no use to mention it to others, that what he knew, since so few people were genuinely interested in generating the awakening mind. So this is very, very interesting. So the point to be extracted here is that Charwa was not teaching on the awakening mind to this particular audience on this particular occasion because it was not appropriate to do so because they lacked sufficient interest in generating bodhicitta. So the next main heading, do not lead those with the wish for the great to the small. And the verse 90 reads, "I should not communicate the Dharma of a lesser being to one who is a vessel for the vast Dharma. I must not forsake the Bodhisattva way of life, nor mislead others by means of sutra or mantras." So this verse is really to be understood as a kind of turning upside down, an inversion of the previous one. Just as one shouldn't teach the vast and profound to one holding the Hinayana, so one should not teach the Dharma of a lesser being to one who is not a vessel for the vast Dharma. This doesn't mean, and we have to be very careful here, that one can't teach and share those foundational teachings that are, by definition, common to both vehicles, which is to say they are practiced in common. Rather, it refers to not seeking to lead or to coax or cajole someone away from their Mahayana lineage by teaching in such a way that they will be tilted or pushed towards adopting a lower vehicle lineage and thus surrender potentially their former practice of the greater, meaning their bodhicitta practice. That this is the meaning here is clearly stated by Gyaltsab Sabje when he says, quote, "Do not lead someone with a Mahayana lineage that is a suitable vessel for the extensive Dharma to a lesser Dharma, such as the hearer's path. It is taught that this becomes a downfall." End of quote. So in other words, if one actually is endowed with the capacity and the penchant to practice the Mahayana, and who is thus a suitable vessel to receive those teachings, then it is a mistake to lead them to adopt, for whatever reasons we might conjure, a hearer's or a solitary realizer's path. Again, it doesn't mean that these paths are in any way faulty, that there is something wrong with them. To think as much would again be to commit a grave error, else it would be effectively denigrating the holy Dharma as earlier described. The third line of the verse, "I must not forsake the Bodhisattva way of life," refers to one, therefore, who has already accepted this lineage as their chosen one. In other words, they are, as Kunsang Pelden puts it, of the Mahayana type. This suggests they are also endowed with sharp faculties and thus are suitable vessels for the vast and profound teachings. Under such favourable and rare conditions, to surrender this training lineage for a lesser lineage would be a substantial loss, not just for that practitioner, but for the countless sentient beings who stood to benefit from their bodhicitta, their bodhisattva actions, and their attainment of the full enlightenment goal. Following this logic, we can also appreciate that it would be inappropriate to teach in a way that would discourage a Mahayanist from wholeheartedly pursuing their own elected vehicle, with even the consequence that they might decide to abandon the mind of enlightenment altogether, which they had formerly aspired towards. The additional instruction in this verse, not to beguile them with the scriptures and spells, again extends the meaning already established. We are still discussing, in other words, inappropriate ways of giving teachings, inappropriate teachings for that matter, making them inappropriate. Or now even, we might now even be employing magical means to discombobulate the listeners so that they become disturbed or distracted or from their spiritual pursuits. The Bachelor translation similarly reads, "nor mislead others by means of sutras or mantras." So the word mislead, the verb mislead here is critical. It's what is being discussed. Shantideva is indicating that we must thoroughly eschew any tendency to beguile or seduce those who are the vessels of our teaching by wooing or overwhelming them with magical spells or a dazzling and possibly incoherent display of scriptures intended not to convey the essential meaning, but to bombard them, using the authority of the scriptures as weapons to uphold not the Dharma in this case, but our own vain ambitions as driven by an opportunistic, self-interested mind. Our motives are impure, in other words. Perhaps such warnings have more relevance to those who actually possess some magical powers, various cities, a knowledge of mantric incantations and spells, etc. In our contemporary worldview, such dangers might seem remote. But we shouldn't become too complacent, as it may indeed apply to those who exaggeratedly consider themselves as tantric masters and thus contrive to influence or control others via esoteric or magical means, even when these means are being faked, are being supposed, fabricated. A tantric practitioner who is not a teacher might also fall into this syndrome, which can extend into the realms of the pernicious, such as cult building. We can also interpret this instruction regarding beguiling through mantras in another way, by applying it directly to ourselves. How so? Geshe Topton explains, quote, "We must never abandon the moral discipline of abstaining from non-virtuous actions, thinking that we will be able to purify them later through the recitation of mantras." So we're beguiling ourselves here, that's the point. At times, bodhisattvas manifest as ministers, heads of state, and so on, in order to prevent beings from committing negative karma and keep moral discipline. Through their position, they rule through laws that forbid murder, robbery, and so forth, by which means they practice the Dharma and encourage others to practice it. The teachings belonging to the Vinaya Pitaka must be observed by a bodhisattva too. And even if he or she is a lay person, they must avoid what might cause loss of faith or loss of respect in others. End of quote. So this last point would pertain to the requirement that a teacher must live in seamless accordance with what they preach. If a disjunct is present, it is inevitable that a disciple will become confused and disillusioned by that teacher. Or they may even be encouraged to similarly pollute their own Dharma practice with moral faults. Therefore, we are spelling out real dangers of teachers bearing impure motivations, especially when they are simultaneously parading or presenting themselves as pure practitioners or masters endowed with or blessed with exceptional powers, even miraculous ones, such as the ability to deflect the path of an arrow with a mere incantation. Finally, as the commentaries make clear, we might also mislead others, not by inducing them to leave their chosen pathway, but by proposing that those who are indeed already well established as qualified trainees might adjust or curtail their training in virtuous ways by suggesting, for example, you don't need to study very much. Just practice these special secret mantras, which I'll give you, and recite them on a daily basis, and all will go swimmingly. You will soon be enlightened. Such promise making, if you like, can be designed with impure motivation to mislead and deceive students. And the painful fact here is that such a teacher is hiding their own mediocrity behind a cunning veneer composed of presumably superior spiritual attainments. His Holiness the Dalai Lama refers to some gurus who pretend to be able to elevate their students, teletransport them, as it were, into the pure realm by reciting particular mantras. the problem facing us in the West, where self-described and self-appointed gurus promise any number of feats, is clearly much greater. So we must appreciate that it's also up to us to make of ourselves suitable vessels. And we're to do this in a robust, a vigorous fashion. We must prepare to do the transformative work of Dharma ourselves, not just rely on a teacher, as might a creeper, a vine upon the trunk of a tree. Prop itself up, as it were, upon something upon which it is hopelessly dependent. We rely on our teachers, but we also develop this kind of clear dignity and stability of purpose based on our own practice. This makes our approach to our teachers very healthy. And the teachers upon whom we rely for their own part should be honest and reliable. So we must check the teacher first and only accept them after a long investigation. We have a classic example of this in the case of the great master Atisha. We're talking here of the 11th century. In Heart of the Path, Kabje Zopa Rinpoche recounts the story. So I quote, another story, wonderful story. Remember the way that Lama Atisha checked Lama Sarvanadvipa before taking teachings from him. Lama Atisha was already a great scholar of the entire Buddha Dharma before he went to Indonesia to receive teachings on bodhicitta from this Lama. At that time, transport was very primitive, so the ship from India took more than 12 months to arrive in Sumatra, where the Lama lived. Even after putting so much effort into the journey, taking many risks and encountering many obstacles, Lama Atisha and his many disciples were all great scholars, expert in the 5 categories of knowledge. But they did not immediately go to see Lama Sarvanadvipa when they arrived at the place where he lived. Instead, they rested for a few days, during which time Lama Atisha checked the Lama's qualities and practices with some of his students, his close disciples. He inquired about the Lama's daily life and practice. Even though Lama Sarvanadvipa, the holder of Maitreya's Buddhist teachings, was famous as a great bodhisattva and renowned for his learning, purity and good heart, Lama Atisha wasn't satisfied simply by his great reputation. He still took time to check, and only after he had analysed the Lama's behaviour did he take teachings from him. Atisha then spent 12 years receiving the bodhicitta, complete teachings, which he received like one pot being poured into another. And in dependence on this, Lama Atisha generated bodhicitta. So this is Kabje Zopa Rinpoche's account. So I'll just mention in passing that we ourselves have the fortune to inherit via the direct and unbroken Tibetan transmission these very same teachings. That is truly remarkable. That is magic. We don't need mantras to understand the magic of that. How much we take for granted. Anyhow, Shantideva asks us to be particularly wary of those who possess Mahasiddhi feats. They are to be tested as follows. And this is an instruction that His Holiness the Dalai Lama gave one year in Bodh Gaya when there was I won't go into details, but a very large scandal concerning a very eminent teacher who had many, many Western students. And the scandal was causing havoc and great confusion and distress amongst those disciples. And His Holiness said that any teacher who claims to have higher siddhis should have the following ability: not only to make a fruit drop from the branch of a tree through the force of their yogic powers, but be able to return that same fruit to the branch. So we have to be cautious, and this is emphasized again and again in the teachings. For example, the Panchen Lama Chökyi Gyaltsen said, I quote, "If you cherish yourself, which is meaning if you respect yourself, don't follow just anyone you happen to meet like a dog seeking food in the street. Examine well the Lama who reveals the holy Dharma, then follow him with respect." So with characteristic thoroughness, Shantideva now follows up the content just discussed with its logical extension. The heading in Gyaltsabje's outlines: protecting sentient beings' minds by training in the actions of not incurring faults. So I'll just preface this with Geshe Doga's words. Because they are such noble beings, engaging in inappropriate actions could cause others to generate a negative mind. And if they were to cause others to be critical of the Bodhisattva, then that would be a cause for them to create very heavy negative karma. Therefore, Bodhisattvas have a great responsibility to engage in appropriate conduct and behaviour to protect the minds of others from the faults of criticism and so forth. This is a very important point to keep in mind. So this section has two subheadings: extensive explanation and summary. The extensive explanation has its own three internal subdivisions: abandoning faulty behaviour that causes others to lose faith, how to act when showing the path, and how to do the action of sleeping. So referring to the first, abandoning faulty behaviour that causes others to lose faith, we have verse 91, which reads, "When I spit or throw away the stick for cleaning my teeth, I should cover it up with earth. Also, it is shameful to urinate and so forth in water or on land used by others." Clearly, these are very specific instructions given by Shantideva regarding bodily decorum in public places. As Gyaltsabje says, ordained bodhisattvas must apply restraint when which is explained in the general basket of teachings on morality, unless there is an exception that permits them otherwise, as it will cause a loss of faith in the minds of others. Even lay bodhisattvas should apply this restraint. So therefore, the above mentioned decorums regarding cleaning one's teeth, pissing and shitting are to be viewed in terms of how they demonstrate appropriate restraint. This is apart from their obvious advantages in terms of displaying modesty and a respect for hygiene. So we must apply this to ourselves, especially if we're lay bodhisattvas or aspiring ones, which is to say that just by being lay rather than ordained does not give us some special license to act in somehow looser or more careless, licentious ways. We must remember that the issue here is still whether or not our actions will prompt others to lose faith upon witnessing our actions. It is not a discussion about the ethical status of executing vital bodily functions themselves. This said, the monks and nuns Vinaya is very specific regarding one's mode of public decorum. So these instructions regarding toothbrush disposal and so forth should not be viewed as overly precise or finicky, fussy, too detailed, because it's by being mindful throughout all our actions that enables us to be gentle and considerate in our behavior. So these are tiny examples, but it's to show the fact that they're tiny is showing the degree of finesse with which the Bodhisattva is approaching the way in which their appearance in terms of decorum is going to be presented to others and therefore influence and affect them. Pema Chodron notes an amusing aside. In response to this verse, she says, Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche said, in India to this very day, they still don't listen to Shantideva, meaning they still toss their toothsticks hither and there on the ground. So we're reminded here again of those naked selfie poses in Bali. Perhaps we also think of the desecration of the sacred Alps of the Himalayas by streams of trekkers leaving piles of feces and rubbish alongside the mountain passes. Tons and tons and tons of it. Apparently there's so much rubbish on the higher mountain passes to Mount Everest and so forth that they can be seen from outer space by satellite. So likewise, to bring this to our immediate social cultural setting, to forcefully eject gobs of spit that land on pathways and seats in public places is surely distasteful, if not downright disgusting, as there is every likelihood that some other person might innocently sit upon it. So I saw this very thing yesterday happen in the street just around the corner. Do we just fling our used tissues, nose tissues, away in the gutters after blowing our nose? Obviously, if a bodhisattva was to act in this way, they would have a hard time convincing their followers that they were concerned with the welfare of others. This is the point. Verse 92, when eating, I should not fill my mouth, eat noisily, or with mouth wide open. I should not sit with my legs outstretched, nor rub my hands together. Though these are again instructions for monks with vows, we're advised to behave with similar decorum, as failing to do so may lead us to be viewed with disdain or disgust. The instruction sitting with legs outstretched revolves around issues of social decorum. Are we being louche in doing so? Again, we must pick our time and place for the manner of our bodily postures. I don't need to go into much detail. We can imagine for ourselves. The point is that we're looking here at the structure of social conventionality itself. The instruction in Shantideva's text of not rubbing our hands together must be understood in the same way. Gyaltsabje rather charmingly proposes that the injunction against rubbing our hands together only prohibits that rubbing them together simultaneously, not sequentially. He then adds, quote, one does not ride together with someone else's woman on a horse and so forth, or sit together with them on the same place or seat. Lay bodhisattvas should also not sit together with another woman who is not a relative. So this refers to the following lines in verse 93, which read, I should not sit alone in vehicles, upon beds, nor in the same room with the women of others. In brief, having observed or inquired about what is proper, I should not do anything that would be disliked by the people of the world. Geshe Doga refers to these words of Gyaltsen Sabje as giving very clear instructions. Yet I feel that we must nonetheless approach them with some care, just as we have with the earlier reference to giving teachings to an unaccompanied woman that we referred to, that are found in verse 89. What is being considered proper and improper here is in the immediate lived terms of public perception, as much as it's about the state of mind of the Bodhisattva, him or herself. In other words, if there is a possibility that the intent of our bodily posture or our bodily placement, if you like, will be misinterpreted or read as a sign of lewd or lascivious or inappropriate behavior, then obviously we are to desist, to avoid it. This is made clear when Gyaltsen Sabje adds to his former comment, one should abandon inappropriate behavior that causes worldly beings to lose faith. One does this either by observing directly what is done or not done, or through informing oneself by inquiring what is appropriate and what is inappropriate according to that place and time. Big bell ringing here. According to that place and time. These words signal the need that we assess in terms of relative cultural conditions and circumstances. This means that, for example, when traveling in unfamiliar cultural territory, we should, it's our onus to ourselves, inquire what is the nature of the local customs so that we can then act accordingly. So I'm going to share here an embarrassing story, personally embarrassing story. I remember once, many years ago, I caused real consternation in a village just outside of Bodh Gaya, where I was staying in a rented room. I decided on this particular occasion to wash my feet in the water that surrounded the base of the local well. No sooner had I begun to do so than many women ran out of their houses yelling at me and waving their arms wildly, requesting me to stop and stop immediately. They were deeply outraged and deeply offended by what I was doing. I hadn't stopped, this is the embarrassing part, I hadn't stopped to think about the significance of the local water supply and the local well in terms of the hygiene and cultural pollution taboo notions that were embedded deeply into the life of that small village. It only then hit me how terribly inappropriate it was for me to decide to wash my body or even a part of it in water that was effectively shared by the community. My Western presumption, this is equivalent to the person climbing Uluru, an implicit variety of arrogance, had rendered me blind to local customs essential to the health and well-being of the entire community. It hadn't occurred to me to more deeply consider how public hygiene and pollution taboos operated in that place at that time, a place where there were no septic toilet systems and no running taps. Geshe-Doga likewise, when giving his commentary on this verse, relates a personal story. He mentions how he had to inquire upon his arrival in Australia how to use the various varieties of cutlery that he found placed before him on the table setting where he was intended to eat. Geshe-Doga therefore advises, quote, "Indeed, whenever we go to a new place, it is appropriate to know the traditions and customs of that place so that we can act appropriately." I just remember in mentioning that story of Geshe-Doga's a very famous scene in Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. Have any of us read that book? Very famous poet, American poet Sylvia Plath wrote a grueling account of her life. And on one occasion, she was at a very formal dinner and she didn't know the nature of all the different table settings in front of her. And very innocently, she picked up and drank the water from the finger bowl to the aghast responses of everyone at the table. We know we go to have a shared meal, we wash our fingers in the finger bowl before moving on to the next course. So anyway, I just mentioned that in passing. The next heading, how to act while showing the path. Again, these instructions flow logically from those just given, so we should interpret them in that vein. Verse 94, I should not give directions with one finger, but instead indicate the way respectfully with my right hand, with my fingers fully outstretched. So rather than discuss the specific semiotics of finger pointing, because we're indeed in the realm here of semiotic language operations, as it were, I'd like to playfully illustrate the need to obey social conventions regarding indicating direction by relating an incident in which societal conventions regarding hand gestures were at once seemingly endorsed and comically torpedoed. It's a story of Tibetans clapping. When the Chinese invaders were parading their victory in Lhasa, the Tibetan people lining the streets repeatedly clapped loudly with their hands. The Chinese were tickled and delighted that their conquest was being greeted with such enthusiastic admiration and honour in this manner. But unbeknownst to the Chinese officials and the army members, the Tibetans were clapping so enthusiastically because for them, ritual loud clapping, which they were now so very, very enthusiastically doing, was a time-honoured Buddhist tradition to dispel or banish the demons. So rather than celebrating the victors, they were seeking to magically banish them. So you'll understand the semiotics of this story by considering how we do ritually clap 3 times following recitation of the Heart Sutra. The underlying moral of the story is that the semiotics of gestures are not inherently existent and hence are dependent upon, reliant upon, how they are established at the level of everyday convention. I'm just doing a little bit of a side sort of turn here, but it's a very, very interesting one, isn't it? We take so much for granted. There is nothing intrinsically offensive in pointing the finger with our left hand. That is not Shantideva's point whatsoever. There is something offensive about it if it's been culturally regarded in terms of common cultural discourse to be offensive. So in Australia, it might be the same in America, giving a violent hands up, thumbs up gesture is interpreted as an extreme insult, a very, very aggressive insult, as it means up yours. up your bum, up your bum. It is deeply offensive. Someone will react instantaneously with upset and rage if you do that gesture towards them. We see these things being acted out in the streets when people jump out of their cars because they're being cut off as they're taking a turn by another driver, and they stop the other driver's car with their own car, and then they jump out and start gesticulating in these sorts of ways. So you can forgive me for sort of picking such crude examples, but that's precisely the point. These gestures of sort of pointing rudely with one's finger or using our thumb in this way work according to how they're going to be received by the recipient or the watcher or the victim for that matter. Likewise, showing direction by extending one's right hand appropriately in cultural terms is greeted as a gesture of warmth, hospitality, and respect. So we use it for both damaging and benefiting, depending on what gestures mean. So all of these instructions, again, they might seem like tiny details of behavior or gestural making, but they represent the overall purpose that Shantideva is getting at, which is to be aware of all of our actions throughout the day, including and night, including even our hand gestures, the way they're working. We're to be conscious of our body, mindful of our body, as well as our mind. Shantideva now moves on to the action of sleeping. Verse 96, just as the Buddha lay down to pass away, so should I lie in the desired direction when going to sleep, and first of all, with alertness, make the firm decision to quickly rise again. Gyaltsabje describes the required ideal pose precisely. For sleeping, assume the position of the protector when he passed into parinirvana. Lie down on your right side with your head in the desired direction, putting your left leg on your right leg and your head onto your right hand, and then sleep well covered with the shogo. This is called, end of quote, this is called the lion sleeping position. We sleep in this way, and indeed, if we can, die in this posture for reasons of auspiciousness. More particularly, as the Lam Rim describes, it is to emulate the fearlessness of a sleeping lion, and therefore capture the kind of majesty and authority of the Buddha. The shogo is the upper yellow robe of the Sangha. As Geshe Doga adds, of course, in actuality, the Buddha is immortal. However, he showed the aspect of passing into nirvana for the purpose of teaching death and impermanence to his disciples. So sleeping in this position is also a reminder for us of death and impermanence. This is what we need to understand here. A praise to Buddha Shakyamuni by way of the 12 deeds states, quote, to exhort the lazy to be quicker, at the pure sight of Kushinagar, you destroyed your deathless Vajra-like body, entering nirvana, homage to this deed. End of quote. So following on from this, Shantideva is recommending that at the time of preparing for sleep, we should approach it with alertness, and one that has the aspect of intending us to arise quickly in the morning. Geshe Doga elaborates, if one goes to sleep, and this is really important to consider, if one goes to sleep with a virtuous mind of love and compassion in one's heart and determines to wake up with an attitude of love and compassion, then it is most likely that one will wake up in that state of mind. We're looking at a continuum there. So unfortunately, the same holds, doesn't it? This is very important to consider, of having angry thoughts immediately before going to sleep, because we're going to wake up tense, irritable, and grumpy, and readily prone to resume the anger that we had left off yesterday. This is how it works. So Geshe-Doga says waking in a virtuous state of mind would be really a wonderful way to start the next day, because in this way, sleep in itself becomes a virtuous activity. This is really beautiful image, isn't it? If we end the day with this in this thought of love and compassion, and combine it with the thought to awake with the mind and the thought of love and compassion, then the intermediate realm, zone, also is charged with the virtue of love and compassion. So it has a much greater power than we might initially consider. So Geshe-Doga says this is why among the 52 mental factors, sleep is specifically included in the category of changeable mental factors. If one has a virtuous mind prior to going to sleep, then the whole period of sleep will be virtuous. Whereas if one has a negative mind prior to going to sleep, that period will be non-virtuous or negative. And if the mind is neutral, then sleep will be neutral. Thus, this is the important point to take from this, it is important and it is possible to turn sleep into a virtuous deed. Additionally, and as Shantideva was saying, prior to going to sleep, we motivate as follows. Tomorrow, I shall practice the Dharma with a newly regenerated body. So to motivate in this way indicates that when one engages in the act of sleeping, we're not just wishing to rejuvenate our body, but we're wishing to utilize that rejuvenated body for the express purpose of benefiting others. So it takes away any self-absorption or any self-purpose in sleeping itself. So likewise, as Shantideva is indicating, we aim to arise not just with a virtuous mind, but quickly, meaning we don't indulge in slothfulness, sinking into multiple pillows and gazing into the magic mirror of our iPads or our phone screens for hours. He's talking about indulgence here. I'm not saying we shouldn't relax and recuperate, but we can go too far and become lazy. To summarize, our aim is to transform each and every one of our actions of body, speech, and mind into virtue, thereby intensifying the strength and continuous momentum of our bodhicitta aspiration. This requires we incorporate how we conduct our sleep, our waking states, and even the intermediate states between the two, especially since the intermediate states bear certain significant similarities with the bardo state, and therefore can have specific implications at the level of highest yoga tantra practice. I just mentioned this in passing. Sleep is much more profound than we realize. We need to investigate its significance in many ways. Shantideva indicates this need to maintain the momentum of our bodhicitta in all ways in the next verse 97, which functions as a summary. Although I'm unable to practice all, meaning I can't possibly practice everything, the limitless varieties of bodhisattva conduct, I should certainly practice as much as has been mentioned here of this conduct that trains the mind. So this is very practical advice concerning how to proceed in our bodhisattva conduct. to be gleaned from this apparently straightforward verse. I say apparently straightforward because to get to the point, we need to dig and contemplate a little. If it is a fact that the varieties of bodhisattva conduct are limitless, and yet our own means to engage in them is currently limited, then obviously the issue comes up, just what is one to practice right now, in the present moment? For clearly one is incapable of practicing everything simultaneously. So the inner instruction here involves considering how one is to practice in a graduated, sequential fashion, as this is how we establish a firm and broad foundation for the articulation and development, in fact, the perfection of the perfections themselves. By proceeding in this coherent and feasible manner, feasible because we can actually do it sequentially, one generates increasingly a refined capacity to perform more and more extensive and subtle bodhisattva deeds, starting with generosity, ethics, and so on. We thus advance step by step. In other words, and this is also implicit advice here, we don't need to seek to achieve everything at once. So there's another dog analogy here given in the Lam Rim. Some of us know, I think it might have been Song Rinpoche. He said, we don't gobble down the Dharma as does a dog a lump of meat. We don't seek to have it take it all at once, do it all at once. Geshe Jampagutso nicely summarizes the verse as follows. Having generated bodhicitta, the points for the bodhisattvas to practice are limitless. They do all have to be practiced, but if we are not able to practice them all from the beginning, what do we do? First, we should train ourselves in the mode of conduct explained above, referring to the verses in Shantideva. These train the mind in relation to eating food, wearing clothes, interacting with people, and helping others in more superficial ways. We should first train in the above good conduct of body, speech, and mind. Then, when we have the ability to train in the finer points of practice, we should train in those too. So again, the point is being made that if we can't work at this more superficial level, what hope is there to work at a more subtle level later on? Verse 98, 3 times by day and 3 times by night, I should recite the Sutra of the 3 heaps, for by relying upon the Buddhas and the awakening mind, my remaining downfalls will be purified. Such purification practice, based as it is upon an earnest recognition of the countless faulty and destructive actions that we have done in the past, particularly those that have harmed either directly or indirectly other sentient beings, would be an example of engaging in the finer points of practice, as Gyaltsabje has earlier mentions in relation to the last verse. Likewise, regarding the Buddhas and the awakening mind itself as the supremely powerful objects upon which to rely in such an ambition to retrospectively purify one's own tainted continuum, is a clear sign that the Bodhisattva or intending Bodhisattva has comprehended in subtle ways the manner in which we did not rely on those holy objects in the past. Very important to think it backwards that way. This is why the actions we performed, particularly the negative ones, driven as they were by the afflictions, and particularly fundamental ignorance, were not capable of creating the conditions for attaining freedom from suffering, whether considered in gross or subtle senses. In other words, our past actions, not combined with relying on our refuge objects in this way, were not concordant with achieving liberation or enlightenment. They were concordant with samsara. So this is a fact that we must face full on. We must own up to this. I remember once when we Tara Institute weekend course on Geshe Doga was giving me commentary on the Bodhisattva purification practice involving the 100 syllable mantra, and I was asked to lead the meditation based on the short sadhana, and I started to invite the students to go back and back and back in time, acknowledging and mopping up more and more and more negative karma. And when the meditation finished and we got to the discussion group, someone jumped on me and said, "Stop being so flamboyant in your presentation. Why on earth do you exaggerate and elaborate so much by going backwards in that sort of way?" And I was a little bit sort of shocked by the comment, I must say, because for me, doing that is critical to what it means to purify. I can remember some things that I've done in the past, which I purify specifically. But as we mentioned when we were looking at Shantideva's second chapter on purification, it's inevitable we can't remember it all. And so we're responsible for mopping up, if you like, through retrogressive imagination, all of those acts which we not just think we might have done, but know we must have done based on the evidence that we're still in the thraldom of the three poisonous minds. It's inevitable that we were in the thraldom of the three poisonous minds in the past. So the need to purify, in other words, doesn't just apply to beginner practitioners. This is how important it is. It applies to the great masters themselves. So in the following account of Tsongkhapa's practice, inspired as it was by the direct oral instructions of Manjushri, during a small group retreat on the slopes of Odi Gungyal Mountain overlooking the beautiful Walker Valley. Quote, this is quoting from Thupten Jinpa's biography of Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa had insisted that during this long retreat, everyone in the small group would initially follow the tradition of the great Kadam masters, starting with building a solid foundation of training their minds in the practices of the common path. Thus, at the start, for everyone, Tsongkhapa included, would be the foundational practices of the common path, namely non-tantric practices like Nundro, preliminary practices of going for refuge to the three jewels, repeated prostrations, contemplation of impermanence, cultivation of mindfulness, awareness, and regulation of emotions, generation of bodhicitta, and deepening one's view and experience of no self and emptiness. Everyone was discouraged from bringing any advanced tantric texts or iconography, with the exception of Thopten Jampol Gatso, who was a long-time mystic, brought a small image of Manjushri. Thopten was also allowed to bring a text on Lamdre, a cycle of instructions connected to higher Griva, Hevajra Tantra, the transmission of which he had recently received. So the retreatants, each in their own cell, first undertook the preliminary practices dedicated to gathering merit and purifying negative karma. Observing a strict regime of 4 sessions a day, they performed the 7-limb worship, prostrations, making offerings to the Buddhas, purifying negative karmas, rejoicing in the good deeds, supplicating the Buddhas to turn the wheel of Dharma, appealing to the Buddhas not to enter nirvana, and dedicating the merit of one's practice to the well-being of all sentient beings. As is customary for purification practice, Tsongkhapa recited the invocation of the 35 confessional Buddhas and performed hundreds of full body prostrations on a daily basis. At the end of his period of preliminary practice, the stone floor on which Tsongkhapa performed these prostrations bore visible signs where his hands and head had touched. Similarly, a flat rock Tsongkhapa used during this retreat for the performance of the mandala offering, symbolically offering the entire universe to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, wiping the surface with the inside of one's right arm and pouring grains over it repeatedly, had been wiped so much that it came to resemble the surface of a mirror. So all of this is to deflect us from the erroneous notion that we can skip the preliminary practices and go straight to practicing so-called Higher Yoga Tantra. I want to tell a similar story here. Many years ago, in the late 80s, I had the privilege of visiting, with the blessings of Geshe Doga, the great Sarah Lama and Abbot Khensa Urgyen Rinpoche, while in solitary retreat in a small retreat hut just outside Dharamsala. When subsequent to the visit, I inquired from one of his senior disciples, the person who was taking care of him in retreat, in fact, as to what tantric retreat Khensa Rinpoche was doing. I was given the very forthright answer: preliminary practices. These were being intensely undertaken in full retreat conditions for full 3 years. The fact that the answer was given back to me in such a blunt and forthright manner is probably entirely due to the effrontery I had shown in even asking the question. I dared to ask what a High Lama's personal retreat practice was in a completely shameless fashion. So I got a very, very definite answer on that occasion, but it hit me as a wonderful teaching, one I clearly haven't forgotten. Do your preliminary practices. So we should view the instruction in this present verse to engage 6 times daily in the purification of the 35 Buddhas of confession, as presented in the Sutra of the Three Heaps, with great seriousness, to implement it if we can. So this need explains why Algot Sabje's main heading for this verse is the methods for purifying the training. So I might continue next week. And I'm going to aim to conclude the verses of the chapter, which is achievable, and to intimate the first verse of the famous 6th chapter on patience. So this chapter, 6th chapter, is of immense importance, and it's famously and frequently taught. For example, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has dedicated an entire book to it, which many of us will have, called Healing Anger. And this book, I believe, has been reprinted more recently under a new title, Perfecting Patience. And when I was considering the change of title there, it suddenly struck me that considering the 2 titles together gives us a concise summary of the intent of this 6th chapter, which is we heal anger by perfecting patience, and we perfect patience by healing anger. So this is clearly very, very important. So we'll hopefully arrive at that very, very point, and then the teachings for the year on this particular topic in the current context will be concluded. So let's just throw it open now to any reflections or discussions we might have. Sunny. Yeah, thank you.
I just want to say thank you for all of your teachings. And recently I've really gone into silence for now 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And I've even stepped back from practices without filling anything and without any shoulds and any shouldn'ts, and just really dropping down. And I'm actually excited to soon, after I finish this work that I'm at for 2 more days, next week I will begin my preliminaries again.
Oh, how wonderful! How wonderful! Yeah.
I can feel the I'm getting ready. But I really needed to let everything go. Because I've had so much happen in the last 2 months. I just really space and silence, but thank you. So tonight's finishing was yeah, there we go.
I was thinking when you were explaining your motive for what you're doing, that it's really your period of silence is actually the equivalent of Shantideva's description of the interim of sleep, isn't it? In the best way, because you had to refresh and revitalize in order to continue. And that was a wonderful way of going forward, because you're not just taking time off at all. You're having a calculated and a very skillful rest. And so rest is a power. One of the the powers. It's not just idleness if it's handled in the correct way. And I know just from the busyness of our lives, what does it mean to be silent? There's almost a kind of anxiety that rises up in us often when we start to be silent, because we think, nothing's happening, nothing's going on, and a panic kind of kicks in. That panic really needs to be explored. It's really a form of egotistical hysteria, because it's not getting fed. Our usual mechanisms aren't being habitually nurtured. And so who are we? What are we? How are we dwelling? What is it to dwell? Merely dwell. So silence is an incredible power in that way to develop that capacity. I find the other comparison, sorry, I'll just finish with the other comparison, is the meditation when we try not to structure the mind, but simply observe it. I think that's the equivalent of what you're describing as your rest as well. It's mindful, and you're not worrying about the past, and at the moment you're choosing not to worry about the future. You're just being bare aware of the unfolding, the effulgence of the world, which is constantly displaying itself. It's remarkable just to be aware of that natural flow, if you like, of rhythm. So you're going to say, yeah.
Well, a client of mine that I'd been caring for 5 years passed away, and it was quite intense. So then I took 13 days and went into the deep desert with no lights, and the night sky was so amazing. I felt like this tiny fleck of dust, just this little dust. It was just it was scary. It was so quiet, except for the coyotes and the birds in the daytime. But it was so beautiful. And then I just have been in this silence, and it's been very helpful. Because, Tibetan teachers talk a lot.
I hope you're not looking at me. I'm
No,
not a
no,
Tibetan
nothing
teacher.
personal to anyone. I
I feel I
come
do a
from
lot
the
of
Zen
talking.
tradition where we
Yes,
sit
well, there you
together
go.
and we
Yeah.
meditate together. We don't talk. And now the Tibetans, all they do is talk.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it?
Thank you.
But they might talk, but you don't need to, as you say. It's I think there's a kind of, if you're looking at the urgency of this precious human rebirth, you know, how fragile and how small it is in time, the lamas are wishing to pour as much of the Dharma into our little vessel, in my case, this thimble vessel, uh, as quickly and as thoroughly as they possibly can in the moments that they have at their disposal. Because to have a conceptual understanding and a conceptual change of mind, for example, seeing the faults of anger in depth through having meditated on the faults of anger, enables us to feel anger arising differently. We notice it in its raw, ugly state, as though it was a monster that had been dwelling there before, but we had always somehow been with it. We were friends of it. And suddenly we look at it thinking, what is that mind? And what is it charging me to do, forcing me to do? I'm generating this hostile thought towards someone, for example, who loves and cares for me dearly because they did some trivial thing, which I've exaggerated to such an extent that the entire appearance of that person now appears abhorrent to me. So this kind of change that's come about through analytical conceptual investigation brings about deep meditational possibilities as well. So that if I then choose to go into retreat and to look at the role of the afflicted minds in our lives, or my life, for example, I could probably do that with a great deal of precision because the lamas have talked about it so much. So I don't think we have to talk all the way up to enlightenment. You know, that Chandrakirti doesn't, all the Madhyamika scholars talk about the meaning of the quelling of the infinite process of mental proliferation that comes upon realizing emptiness, for example, directly. All of those proliferations sort of dissolve away in that space, metaphorically. So it's there's great expanses here that can be achieved, great openness. Yeah. So I think silence for a busy Western person with real daily stresses and struggles, as we have, is an incredibly precious commodity. And it's not easy to achieve, is it? Like, where do you go to be silent? I went to a silent retreat on one occasion and discovered within almost minutes of sitting down that I had a forest being felled next door to me with giant chainsaws and trucks. And so suddenly the environment was at one of the most raucous environments I could possibly have chosen. So the great challenge from a yogi's perspective, I'm not saying I'm a yogi, but from a yogic perspective, is to meditate with open, calm silence in the middle of noise as well. So we can also look at silence as a power in that way as well. Yeah. So Shantideva's shown incredible particularity, hasn't he, in these verses? And I hope I present in such a way that we consider the depth of import in those examples for the reasons that I've mentioned. Often these verses are skated over, and in many of the commentaries, they're collected together in a kind of slab with no intermediate commentary between the verses or on the particular verses. And I feel that, I'm not saying that's a mistake, because often people are pushed for time giving commentaries, but there's certainly a great value in spending time trying to get at why Shantideva is refining, polishing such exquisitely tiny points while talking about the Bodhisattva's conduct. There's a reason for that. Yeah. Do you have any particular wishes in the last session beyond seeing if we can cover the other verses, or would you like to head off in another direction, or what's your feeling? Stephen, you're nodding, but I'm not quite sure.
Well, I was thinking the plan that you proposed, Ross, sounded great to me.
All right. Yeah. All right. I'll proceed on that basis. You'll notice that I gave up some time ago the need to somehow do the text for the reason that I've just mentioned. So I'm not upset that I haven't got further along with it. It's been a great delight and very, very special for me to spend this time preparing and considering the teachings. And I've always had you in mind, and I really respect your dedication in continuing to support the classes over a significant slab of time. So it's been very special for me. And I've often thought, I haven't actually met any of you in person in terms of flesh, but I feel that I have nonetheless spent a lot of intimate time with you. And the internet is in some ways disembodying and sort of remote, but it can be used in another way, can't it, to bridge gaps and distances in hitherto unimaginable magical ways. And so I feel that any karmic benefits we have of spending this time together can also ripen with us making a promise to continue to look after one another's Dharma practice and to share as much as we can. So thank you very much. So do the dedication prayers. Thanks, Lou.
For as long as space endures, as long as living beings remain, until then may I provide to dispel the mystery of the world. May all the pains of living creatures ripen upon myself. Through the might of the Bodhisattva Sangha, may all beings experience happiness. May the teachings which are the sole medicine for suffering, origin of every joy, be a very long time. I prostrate to Menjigosha. Through his kindness, wholesome minds ensue. And I prostrate to my spiritual masters. Kindness I develop. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I attain the state of a Guru Buddha. All living beings, without exception, into that enlightened state. Whoops. Green jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen, arise and grow. With that which has arisen, diminish but increase more and more. May my venerable Lama's light be firm, his white divine action spread in the 10 directions, calling the dark beings in the 3 realms. Like prayers for his holiness the Dalai Lama, granting wish fulfilling jewel, source of physical benefit and happiness in this world. May all, to the incredibly kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. In a land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until self existence is ended. Friend of his Lama Zopa Rinpoche, fearless teacher, an assembly of children of victorious ones, Bhakras, Eka Buddhas, victorious Losang father and sons, lineage, all the operators of the infinite lands. Please now bestow the virtue and goodness to accomplish this prayer. In holding and spreading the Muni's precious and deep teachings, nation and practice, you are the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Honorable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. Sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, while striving to leave your welfare, the victorious one's teachings and mother being departed to me. At this I lost hope. Nevertheless, the undeceiving truth rejeweled in the great waves of the mind generation of the children of Victoria, smile of a new reincarnation, filthy beaming glory for fortune.
Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you next week.